There's a bit of controversy once again in the news, where an Ubuntu developer accused Linux Mint of being insecure. So let's see what happened, and I'll explain, as a trained security professional, why his arguments are actually partially correct. So all this started with a post where someone asked about creating their own version of Ubuntu with the Mate desktop. It might, for example, allow security updates which are explicitly hacked out of Linux Mint for Xorg, the kernel, Firefox, the bootloader and various other packages, so that you do not have to go online with a vulnerable system. Now, this isn't entirely new news to me. This is something I mentioned over a year ago when I reviewed Linux Mint 13. That the Mint Updater's default settings prevent kernel updates, and that's okay for now, but come 4 years down the line, there's going to be quite a few security risks with an old Linux kernel. Now, not all of this post is correct, because Firefox gets updated, the bootloader is fairly irrelevant, Xorg, again, fairly irrelevant, but the kernel, well, in Linux Mint 13 now, I would call this a security liability. Now, this is some of the news about it. So, Canonical developer criticises Linux Mint security, called a vulnerable system. Yep. That's the basic article. This is Muxware's article back. Linux Mint falsely accused of being insecure. Well, no, actually, the developer was partially correct. Here is Clem's answer. Answering the controversy, stability versus security is something you can configure. Oh, absolutely. You can indeed configure this through the Update Manager. But this video is not for power users, because as power users, you can configure your own system, set which updates you're going to install, or even install a completely different kernel. Note, this is for the everyday Joe user who is just going to use the computer as it's been pre-configured. So, we explained in 2007 what the shortcomings were with the way Ubuntu recommends that users blindly apply all available updates. We explained the problems associated with the regressions, and we implemented a solution we're very happy with. Yeah, actually I've got partial agreement to that, because the way that Canonical maintain their kernel is actually pretty poor. But Clem, you've got your own distro here. You do not have to use the Ubuntu packages. You could use a kernel from a different source. I don't know, like the Debian kernel, or the kernels from the mainline PPA. That's not a very good argument there. In fact, that's a really poor argument. What he's saying is that, we're just going to stop the problem, but we're not going to fix it. So anybody running Mint can launch the Update Manager, edit preferences, enable level 4 and 5 updates, thus making their system secure and unstable as Ubuntu. Refer to my previous argument. You are in charge of your repositories, you could fix the problem yourself. About the Firefox updates, yes, as I explained, that's actually incorrect. Firefox does get updated. I personally talked to the legal team at Canonical for other reasons. They're telling us we need a license to use their binary packages, and it's clear that they're confused about LMDE and Mint. They do not know what repositories we're using, they do not know what we're doing. True, because you mirror the Canonical repositories, so we don't entirely know which repositories you are using. We're 2 years younger than them, and they have no idea how many users we have. Well, if you're boasting about number of users, that's completely the incorrect thing to do when you're trying to balance off security and stability, because what malware authors do is they target the most popular operating system. So what you're doing is waving a big red flag to them and saying, "Whoa, look at us! Whoa, we're big and vulnerable, so come and attack us." Wrong argument there. Alright, okay, the rest of the article is just chaff. So let me explain how vulnerable the kernel is now in Linux Mint 13. That's the comparison, Ubuntu 12.04.3 and Linux Mint. So, kernel here is 3.8.0-33. That's what it's been updated to. However, in Linux Mint 13, we have 3.2.0-23. It was the kernel it came pre-installed with, and I waited for it to do all its updates, but the kernel did not get changed at all, as to be expected. So how much of a security risk is the kernel in Linux Mint 13 compared to the much newer kernels? Well, let's go through it. So all these CVE numbers here, which are common vulnerabilities and exposures, have been listed out by Canonical, and what they've patched and what they haven't in the Linux kernel. So I'll go through a few of them. KVM implementation in the kernel before 3.3.4 does not properly manage the relationships between memory slots and the I/O MMU, which allows guest OSs to cause a denial of service, memory leak, and host OS crash. The NFS get ACL uncached function in the NFS version 4 implementation in the Linux kernel before 3.3.2 uses an incorrect length during the copy operation, which allows remote NFS servers to cause denial of service. The CRC32 feature in the btree file system implementation in Linux kernel before 3.8 RC1 allows local users to cause denial of service, extended runtime of the kernel code by creating many different files whose names are associated with the same CRC32 hash value. Once again, the CRC feature in the btree file system, another vulnerability. The Linux kernel through to 3.7.9 allows local users to obtain sensitive information about keystroke timings using the iNotify API on the dev PTMX device. The IPv6 create temp address function in the Linux kernel through to 3.8 does not properly handle problems with the generation of IPv6 temporary addresses, which allows remote attackers to cause denial of service via the IPv6 router advertisement messages. Sounds very similar to the vulnerabilities in all versions of Windows. That's quite funny, that one. I've got an old video about Windows 8 being attacked with the IPv6 router advertisement messages. The use free vulnerability in Arch x86 KVM in the Linux kernel through to 3.8.4 allows guest OSs to cause denial of service. The guest OSs again, okay. The dispatch discard IO function in the Zen bulk back implementation of the Linux kernel before 3.10.5 allows guest OSs to cause denial of service, data loss via the file system. Another guest OS. Multiple array index errors in the human interface device subsystem in the Linux kernel through to 3.11 allow physically proximate attackers to execute arbitrary code to cause a denial of service, heap memory corruption via a crafted device that provides an invalid report ID. Another human interface device, and another one, and another, once again, even more, and another IPv6 error. The IPv6 SCPT implementation in the Linux kernel through to 3.11.1 uses data structures and function calls that do not trigger an intended configuration of IPsec encryption, which allows remote attackers to obtain sensitive information by sniffing the network. NSA, anyone? Another IPv6 vulnerability. So basically, the total number of vulnerabilities recorded in the Linux kernel in 2012 was 115, and in 2013 it was 172. So returning to Clem's argument, it is indeed an issue of stability versus security. It's annoying that Linux Mint make absolutely no attempt to resolve the issue themselves by providing a better maintained kernel. But we do have users now on Linux Mint 13 which are liable to be hacked at some point. Not going to say you're definitely going to be hacked, but I would say there's a liability there. Some malware author could put out an internet exploit that could attack Linux Mint. Now, all those vulnerabilities, yeah, for the home user, they're not going to be particularly vulnerable to that. For a small business, yeah, that's more so. That's certainly a risk if a small business is running Linux Mint. So what is the answer? Well, take a backup of your system, do a full update, and if it works, job done. If it's unstable and buggy, you can roll back the update. So that's my opinions on the controversy. Thanks for watching. See you later.